A judge thought he could bully Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, in open court, but she flipped the script and exposed his flaws in minutes. You won't believe how this showdown ends. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. That morning, she walked into courtroom 3B of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse thinking this was just a simple hearing, a quick administrative procedure like so many before. She had been here countless times, facing all kinds of judges, from the stern and unforgiving to the lenient and approachable. But this time, something felt off. Judge Thomas Hargrove, a tall man with a silver beard and piercing eyes, entered the room with an unmistakable presence, a man who did not tolerate defiance. There were no usual formalities, no time to review files or hear arguments from both sides. "Let's get straight to the point," Hargrove said, his voice calm yet commanding. "The court has reviewed the case and determined that the defendant has violated Local Statute 14B. Therefore, the court imposes a fine of $10,000, effective immediately. No discussion, no chance to plead her case." Karoline Leavitt raised an eyebrow slightly, but inside her mind was already calculating. Everything was happening too quickly, too decisively, as if this trial were merely a performance with a predetermined ending. She glanced at the city prosecutor sitting across from her. Even he seemed surprised by the speed of the proceedings, his hands unconsciously tightening around the case file in front of him, as if he hadn't expected everything to be over so easily. Karoline knew that if she didn't speak up now, this wouldn't just be a fine, it would be a statement of power, a lesson for anyone daring to challenge the system. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm but sharp. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun the proceedings. I haven't had the opportunity to present my arguments." Hargrove barely reacted. "There's no need. The violation is clear. The law is the law." Karoline tilted her head, studying him. There was something in the judge's eyes, not just certainty in his ruling, but a challenge. And at that moment she knew she had to fight not just for herself, but for a greater principle. The law could not be bent to serve power. Karoline Leavitt was not someone who backed down easily, especially when she knew she was standing on solid legal ground. She met Judge Hargrove's gaze, her tone calm but razor-sharp. "Your Honor, if the law were truly as clear as you say, this trial wouldn't exist." The room fell silent for a moment. A few whispers rippled through the audience, and even the city prosecutor lifted his eyes from his case file, as if realizing that things were becoming more complicated than expected. Hargrove leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression unchanged. "Miss Leavitt, as I've said, the outcome will not change. The law is the law, and I am enforcing it." Karoline nodded slightly, as if she had anticipated this response, but instead of reacting, she calmly turned a page in the file before her, then looked back at the judge. "I greatly respect your perspective, Your Honor, but let's discuss the law with more precision." She placed a finger on the document in front of her, her voice slow and steady. "Statute 14B, the very law you are citing to impose this fine, has in fact been challenged in multiple lawsuits over the past 5 years. Would you like me to remind you of a few cases?" Hargrove frowned but did not stop her. Karoline continued, her tone still composed, as if she were merely giving a lecture on legal precedents. For example, in Reynolds v. Clearwater, the court dismissed a similar penalty after determining that the provisions of Statute 14B were too vague and lacked the specificity required for lawful enforcement. The judge in that case ruled that any penalty imposed without clear scope and execution guidelines could be overturned. She paused briefly, watching Hargrove's reaction. His expression remained cold, but his eyes had sharpened. "But that's not all," Karoline continued, flipping to another page in her file. "Last year in Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, an appellate judge ruled that imposing fines under Statute 14B without proper legal proceedings was unconstitutional, as it violated the defendant's right to a fair trial." The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier. Karoline knew she had just landed a serious blow to Hargrove's argument. Hargrove rested his hands on the desk, his voice lowering slightly. "Those cases don't apply here." Karoline offered a small smile, not one of defiance, but of confidence, signaling that she had anticipated this response. "They don't apply, Your Honor? Could you explain why?" "Because from a legal standpoint, we are facing the same issue. A statute that lacks the clarity required for lawful enforcement She locked eyes with Hargrove, refusing to look away. She could see him thinking, searching for a way to counter her argument, but Karoline didn't stop. She leaned forward slightly, her voice firm and commanding. And more importantly, if these legal precedents are irrelevant, then why did higher courts issue rulings to amend this law? If the statute were as clear as you claim, these cases wouldn't have existed in the first place. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Lawyers and legal clerks watched intently, and even the prosecutor had begun to lose the confidence he had at the start. Karoline knew she had just accomplished something crucial. She hadn't just refuted Hargrove's argument, she had forced him to justify his ruling with a solid legal foundation, and that, she was certain, he could not do. The tension in the courtroom had never been higher. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just making a sound legal argument, she was shaking Judge Hargrove's confidence. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes never leaving him. Your Honor, denying the defendant the opportunity to present their argument could constitute a violation of due process. Are you certain you want to proceed with the trial this way? Hargrove hesitated for a second. Few people dared to challenge a judge so directly in his courtroom, but Karoline Leavitt was unlike anyone else. He pressed his lips together, then spoke slowly, more carefully than before. This court has full authority to rule based on existing law, Ms. Leavitt. Karoline tilted her head, studying his reaction. Full authority, yes, but not absolute power. She tapped a finger lightly on the file in front of her, then looked straight at the judge. If we're talking about enforcing the law, then I want to talk about evidence. Karoline's words sent a hush through the courtroom. Your Honor, may I ask what evidence was used to justify this fine? Hargrove frowned. The evidence is outlined in the violation report. Karoline nodded as if she had expected that response, then turned to the enforcement officer who had issued the fine. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this penalty? Officer Brian Calloway, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed uniform, straightened in his seat. Yes, that's correct. Karoline stepped toward him, one deliberate step at a time, not rushing. Her voice remained calm but crystal clear. Good. Then can you tell the court how you gathered evidence before issuing this fine? Calloway blinked, seeming slightly caught off guard by the question. I conducted a direct inspection and determined that a violation had occurred. Karoline gave a small, knowing smile. I see. And did you take any photographs as evidence? Calloway took a slow breath. No, that wasn't necessary. The room fell into silence. Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. Not necessary, she repeated, her tone laced with meaning. Calloway sat up straighter. I have years of experience in identifying violations. I don't need photographs to know when an infraction has occurred. Karoline glanced at Judge Hargrove, then turned back to Calloway. So you also didn't collect witness statements? No video evidence? No documentation to support the violation besides your personal judgment? Calloway remained silent. Karoline turned back to the court, her gaze locking onto Hargrove. Your Honor, under current procedural law, a penalty must be based on verifiable evidence, not merely the subjective judgment of an enforcement officer. Hargrove crossed his arms, but Karoline didn't give him the chance to interrupt. We cannot penalize someone just because an officer feels that a violation occurred, without photos, without video, without witnesses. Where is the evidence? Who ensures that this penalty is justified and free of error? She slowly walked back to the defense table, her eyes locked on Hargrove. If you choose to uphold this fine, then you are effectively saying that a court can issue rulings without any evidence at all. Hargrove said nothing. Karoline knew she had just cornered him. If he upheld the ruling, he would be indirectly admitting that the court had the power to impose penalties without evidence, a dangerous precedent. If he overturned it, it would be a concession that he had been wrong from the start. Neither option favored him. Hargrove exhaled sharply through his nose, his eyes narrowing, but Karoline could see it clearly. He was wavering. The air in the courtroom felt compressed, the tension almost tangible. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Karoline Leavitt had just put Judge Hargrove in a difficult position, and he knew it. Hargrove stared at Karoline for a long moment before abruptly speaking. This court will recess for 15 minutes. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, startling many. Legal arguments like this were rarely interrupted so abruptly, but Karoline wasn't surprised. She knew Hargrove didn't want to make a decision in the heat of the moment. He needed time, but for what? Karoline watched as Hargrove exited the courtroom, striding quickly through the door leading to the judge's chambers. She could feel the stir in the room. Some attorneys exchanged knowing glances. A few even whispered among themselves. She knew exactly what they were thinking. Hargrove was looking for backup, and sure enough, when the door swung open again, Hargrove wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Judge Alan Whitaker. Whitaker recognized him immediately, a higher-ranking judge, more experienced and authoritative than Hargrove. His sudden appearance in the middle of a trial was anything but ordinary. What did this mean? Hargrove had lost control of the situation and needed someone with more power to regain it. Whitaker took his seat with the composure of a man accustomed to managing crises. He clasped his hands in front of him, his sharp gaze fixed on Karoline. "Mr. Leavitt, I understand that you have concerns about the legality of this ruling." Karoline met his stare without flinching. "Not concerned, Your Honor. I am stating that this ruling lacks a clear legal foundation." Whitaker didn't respond immediately. He gave a slow nod, as if carefully weighing each of her words. "I have reviewed your arguments, and I want to clarify one point. While you have cited legal precedents challenging the enforcement of Statute 14b, there is an additional ruling that upheld its validity." Karoline blinked once. "Ah, so this was their strategy." Hargrove couldn't win by directly debating her, so he had brought in Whitaker to shift the approach, using a different ruling to try and justify Statute 14b. But Karoline was ready. She nodded slowly, then gently placed both hands on the file in front of her, poised and unshaken. "I'm well aware of the ruling you're referring to, Judge Whitaker," Karoline said, her voice calm yet firm. "And I also know that even that decision emphasized a critical condition. Any penalty under Statute 14b must be supported by verifiable evidence." Whitaker tilted his head slightly. "And what exactly are you implying?" Karoline flipped to another page in her file, her words crisp and deliberate. "I'm referring to what I've already pointed out, that no evidence was collected to substantiate this alleged violation. Judge Hargrove can cite any ruling he wants, but without evidence, enforcing this penalty still violates the most fundamental legal standards." The courtroom felt frozen in place. Whitaker remained silent for a moment. Then he turned to Hargrove, as if expecting an explanation, but Hargrove said nothing. Karoline pressed forward. "We cannot selectively cite a ruling while ignoring the critical conditions attached to it. Even if Statute 14b remains in effect, it still mandates a lawful enforcement process, one that quite clearly was not followed in this case." She met Whitaker's gaze directly. "So tell me, Your Honor, does this court intend to impose a penalty based on nothing at all?" The courtroom was utterly silent. Hargrove looked at Whitaker, searching for an escape, but for the first time in this entire trial, no one responded to Karoline Leavitt right away. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Karoline knew she was at a critical turning point. If she kept applying pressure, Hargrove would have no choice but to admit his mistake. After a long moment of silence, Whitaker finally spoke, his tone measured. "Ms. Leavitt, you have presented some compelling arguments, but rather than debating further, I propose a different approach. Let's hear directly from the enforcement officer who issued this penalty." Karoline's lips curved slightly. They were trying to salvage the situation, but all this did was give her the perfect opportunity to deliver the final blow. Officer Brian Calloway was called back to the witness stand. Karoline stood up, walking toward him with absolute confidence. "Officer Calloway, we've discussed the penalty you issued. Now I'd like to clarify a few more details." Calloway swallowed. "I'm ready to answer." Karoline nodded. "Good. So let me ask again. Did you take any photographs as evidence of this violation?" Calloway blinked, then shook his head. "No." "Do you have any video recordings or any documented records of the incident?" Another shake of the head. "Do you have any witnesses, aside from yourself, who can confirm this violation?" Calloway looked down, hesitating. "No," but Karoline cut him off immediately. "So let me clarify this. You issued a penalty based solely on your personal judgment, without any objective evidence. Is that correct?" Calloway pressed his lips together. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath. Finally, he was forced to answer. "Yes." Karoline turned smoothly, her gaze locking onto Judge Hargrove and Judge Whitaker. Your Honors, I ask this court, if there is no evidence, no witnesses, and no supporting documentation, what is the legal basis for imposing this fine? Hargrove clenched his hands on the bench but remained silent. Karoline continued, her voice sharp but unwaveringly composed. If this court upholds this penalty, it is effectively saying that anyone can be fined simply because an officer claims a violation occurred. No evidence required, no due process. Is that the precedent we want to set? No one answered. Karoline scanned the courtroom, letting her words settle before pressing forward. Your Honors, if this penalty is upheld, it will directly contradict the most fundamental legal principles, that every defendant has the right to a fair trial, and that every accusation must be supported by concrete evidence. Do you truly want to go down in history as the one who shattered that principle? This time, she locked eyes with Hargrove. He could no longer avoid the moment. For a brief second, Hargrove closed his eyes, as if waging an internal battle. Karoline knew he was weighing the consequences. If he upheld the ruling, she would appeal. A higher court would overturn the case and rule against him. His reputation and credibility would take a serious hit. A heavy silence filled the room. Then finally, Hargrove opened his eyes and let out a deep breath. Hargrove lowered his gaze to the bench, then slowly lifted his head. His voice was low and rigid. This court finds that this case lacks the necessary evidence to enforce the penalty. The entire room seemed frozen in time. Hargrove took a measured breath before continuing, each word spoken with visible reluctance. The fine is dismissed. Karoline maintained her composed expression, but inside she knew she had won. Around the room, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Some attorneys exchanged knowing glances. Even the city prosecutor pressed his lips together, as if he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Hargrove struck his gavel against the bench, his voice heavier than ever. Court is adjourned. With a single sound of the gavel, the battle was over. Karoline Leavitt had not just defended herself. She had reclaimed justice. She rose to her feet, calmly gathering her documents. There was no need for celebration, no trace of smugness. It wasn't necessary. Her victory wasn't about gloating. It was about the impact it would leave behind. As she walked out, she could feel the weight of the courtroom's gaze on her. Some looked impressed, others wary, but the most important thing, no one could ignore what had just happened. She hadn't just won a case, she had challenged power. As she reached the courtroom doors, a familiar voice called from behind. Ms. Leavitt, a moment. Karoline turned. Judge Alan Whitaker. He no longer wore the stern expression he had held during the trial. Instead, there was something else, a trace of contemplation mixed with something harder to read. Karoline crossed her arms. Is there something you need, Your Honor? Whitaker studied her for a moment before speaking slowly. You know that today's trial wasn't really about a fine, don't you? Karoline gave a small, knowing smile. Of course. Whitaker nodded, as if he had expected that response. Stepping closer, he lowered his voice just enough so that only Karoline could hear. I wasn't called here to rule. I was called here to control. Karoline felt the weight behind those words. Control who? She asked. Though deep down, she already knew the answer. Whitaker held her gaze. You. A light breeze drifted through the courthouse hallway, but between them, the air was impossibly heavy. Karoline said nothing, simply watching Whitaker's reaction. Do you understand what you just did? He asked. She shrugged. I simply asked the court to follow due process. Whitaker smirked, as if she had just said something naive. No, you just showed the entire system that it can be challenged. And trust me, that is not something the people in power want to see. Karoline remained composed. Then that gives me even more reason to keep going. Whitaker let out a slow sigh, but in his eyes beneath the caution, there was a flicker of respect. You're a good lawyer, Miss Leavitt, but people in power don't forget lawyers like you. And they don't like to lose. Karoline nodded slowly. Neither do I. They held each other's gaze for a moment, two adversaries recognizing the sharpness in the other. Finally, Whitaker lowered his voice even further. From now on, people will be watching you. And not just in cases like this. Karoline understood instantly. This was no longer about a fine, no longer about a vague statute. This was about power and control. She had just set a dangerous precedent for those at the top, but instead of fear, Karoline Leavitt only offered a faint smile. "I appreciate the warning, Judge Whitaker." He nodded, though his gaze remained contemplative. "Be careful, Ms. Leavitt. Not everyone wants the law to be enforced fairly." Karoline turned away and walked out of the courthouse. She knew that from this moment on, nothing would be the same. But if there was one thing she was certain of, she was ready for the next battle. Karoline Leavitt strode out of the courthouse, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the marble floor of the long hallway. She didn't look back. There was no need. What needed to be said, she had said. What needed to be done, she had done. No cheers, no applause, but she knew she had won something far greater than a case. This victory wasn't just about overturning an unjust fine. It was about the message she had sent, that the law could not be wielded as a weapon of power, that no one could be punished simply because someone said they were guilty. She wasn't the first to stand against a broken system, but every time someone did, it set a precedent. And a precedent, when placed in the right hands, could change the way a system worked. Karoline knew this was far from the final battle. Men like Hargrove, those who believed they could make decisions without being questioned, would not disappear. They would be back. But she also knew something else. They would never again make arbitrary rulings without being challenged. Personally, I think Karoline Leavitt's stand in that Miami-Dade courtroom is a wake-up call. She didn't just win a case, she showed that power doesn't get a free pass when it bends the law. It's inspiring to see someone refuse to back down, proving that justice isn't about who's loudest or highest up, it's about evidence and principle. I believe this is what the system needs, people bold enough to question it, ensuring it stays accountable. But I get it, not everyone might agree. Some could argue she pushed too hard, that challenging authority like this risks chaos or undermines order. Maybe they're right, stability matters too. Was she a hero for fighting, or did she overstep by cornering a judge so publicly? I'd love to hear your take. Do you think she was fearless or reckless? To me, her victory says one thing. The law isn't a tool for the powerful to wield unchecked. Thanks for watching this story unfold with me. It's your support that keeps these tales coming. Drop a comment with your thoughts, hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more gripping battles.